Hello, and welcome to the National Press Foundation. I'm Sonni Efron, president of NPF, and we're coming to you from the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios in Washington, D.C. Yesterday, the White House announced that President Biden will be traveling to Tulsa, Oklahoma next week to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the race massacre, where 37 city blocks were burned and the most thriving Black business community in the country was wiped out. Fast forward 100 years, and we're seeing that COVID-19 is posing a new threat to Black and minority-owned businesses, some of which failed at 4 times the rate of white-owned businesses. And today we'll be talking about what it will take to recover. So today I'm so delighted to have with us 3 speakers to brief you on what's happening to minority-owned businesses in America. And I should note that they've each done a lot of work digging up facts and data of particular relevance to journalists. So I want to thank them for their hard work. Our first speaker is Major Clark, who is the Small Business Administration's leading expert on minority-owned business. Next, we'll have Patrice Willoughby of Signal, who will be talking about the effects on families and especially on women, as well as other disadvantaged communities. And finally, we'll have Tony Draper of Afro News in Baltimore, one of the longest running African-American owned newspapers in America, and herself an expert on Baltimore. We'll have plenty of time for questions, so please feel free to raise your Zoom hand during the show or drop a question in your chat. And with that, Major, let me turn this over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And it is an honor and a pleasure to be part of this event today. And more specifically, it's an honor and a pleasure for me to be part of this very distinguished panel. And I look forward to some engaging in some very enlightening conversations regarding the topics. I would like to start out by letting everyone know that even though I'm the acting chief counsel for the Office of Advocacy of SBA, Office of Advocacy, my comments today are not comments from the administration. They're my personal views. And there will be information presented, which will be public data that's available for anyone to retrieve. So I want to just make it clear that I'm speaking on behalf of Major Clark today and not the administration on whatever however we move forward with this. I would also like to take this opportunity to deal with the myth. And the myth, as we talk about COVID and the impact on Black and minority businesses, the myth is that Black businesses are always looking for a handout. And I want to just make it clear that from my experiences throughout my public career and so forth, Black businesses are not really looking for a handout in the economy. They're looking for a hand in the economy. They want to participate. And this is what's driving and has driven Black businesses for such a long period of time. So just want to make sure that we understand we're looking for a hand in and not a handout. As we move to a discussion of the COVID, one of the things we find is that the COVID, the implication of COVID in terms of the economy was very devastating, not only to Black businesses, minority businesses, but also to small businesses. If we go to the slide, we'll see the small businesses fell about 27% from mid-March to mid-April in one of the studies that was actually done. And this was a tremendous drop in the number of small businesses that were out there. And by the way, small businesses are the economic backbone of this nation. They're about 98. Small businesses represent about 98 to 99% of all businesses in the United States. So when we see a drop of 27%, that's a tremendous impact on the economy. As we begin to look, and we look at the next slide, we'll see that there is some distinction between Black businesses in terms of business owners before and after the COVID. And I'll leave that slide there for you to to kind of look at as you go through it. But what we attempted to do was to look at the impact before and after, so that we had a better gauge of what was going on with the tremendous economy turndown as it impacted small businesses. But as we move to the more specifics, we'll see, I think in the next slide, if my slide deck is correct, we'll see that African-American businesses dropped 41% during this period. And Latino businesses dropped 32%, Asian businesses 26%, and women businesses 25%. So this COVID, as you know, while it is a World Health issue, has also been a tremendous economic issue for the United States, and especially for businesses within the United States. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see, we'll take those percentages and we'll see that African-American businesses fell from 1.1 million to 640,000 in April 20. And we just look at the rest of the drops that occurred. And again, these are a tremendous decline in the number of businesses in our economy and in our community. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that there, change in Black self-employment by gender. I'll let you look at that in more detail, as we go. But again, just another example of how devastating this health crisis has been on the economy in the United States. And then we can begin to actually, for research purposes and discussion purposes, we can begin to actually look at more detailed impacts by breaking down the industries that we have. And the next slide, I think, will give you a better breakdown of some of the industries and the decline in those specific industries. And leisure, you'll see leisure and art and accommodation had the largest decline, and by far that's where a large number of our Black and minority businesses are basically housed. So when we look at this, from an economic standpoint, COVID has had a devastating impact on our businesses, Black and minority businesses. But I want to also share with you a different type of impact, because as we have talked about COVID, and Congress has done a tremendous job in providing financial resources to many of the industries through the PPP loans and economic injury loans and other types of loan programs. We have now 2 loan programs out, Charlotte Homes and restaurant loan programs, again, trying to help the small and minority business community. But one statistic that I would like to share with you, which I'm not sure if I have a slide there, but it's with the Department of Defense. And this is where we are talking about the fact that if we look at the Department of Defense during this COVID period, that of the about $61 billion that was spent by the federal government to provide goods and services during this COVID period, about 38% of that was spent by the Department of Defense. And of that 38%, the numbers from the Federal Procurement Data Center reveals that small businesses, minority businesses, Black-owned business specifically, received only 1.97% of that amount of money. So on one hand, when we talk about the fact that there has been a devastation in the Black community from COVID, the more devastating or an equally devastating concern is the fact that the government has had an opportunity to actually provide contracting opportunities to these businesses and did not, for whatever reason, use those opportunities to provide those contracting dollars. So 1.97% of DoD money is a very small percentage of the money going into the Black community from the federal budget process. So that's kind of the layout of COVID as it has impacted the small and especially the minority business community. But I want to share with you, though, and I got a few more minutes before Sonni actually tells me my time is up, but I want to go back for a moment because I think it's very important for us to understand that the situation we are examining today is not a situation that just occurred today. That this situation that we're looking at is a situation that has occurred over a period of time. I had the pleasure this morning of listening to a small business congressional hearing in which Congresswoman Lydia Velazquez was chairing. And one of the things that she made in her opening statement was that we're talking about systemic inequality in the system. And in order to understand that in a different context, I would like to go back to a period starting about 1977, in which a member of Congress, Congressman Perrin J. Mitchell from the 7th Congressional District of Baltimore, introduced an amendment to what was then President Carter's local public works program legislation. And that amendment basically required the government to earmark 10% of its funds for minority businesses. This is the first time this had been done in a long time. That legislation actually passed. It went through, and small and Black businesses, minority-owned businesses began to receive, through competitive processing, tremendous contract support from the federal government. Unfortunately, that legislation was ultimately challenged in court. It ultimately went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court, in the case of Full Love versus Klutznick, upheld the constitutionality of that provision, of that particular amendment. And that amendment actually served as the springboard for other developments for Black and minority businesses for the federal arena, especially with the 8A program, especially with small disadvantaged business program, and especially with the SBIR, Small Business Innovation and Research Program. All of these things were designed to provide assistance to small and minority businesses. But because of various attacks on these programs, the programs have become less effective. And as a result of their less effectiveness, we're now at a point in which we are looking at COVID and trying to understand and how to put in place new programs so that we don't have the reoccurrence of what we've had. As an example, there's a program called the Category Management Program, which is run by the federal government. And data recently released shows that that of 100,000+ small businesses that are eligible for contracts, that number has now dropped to 70-some thousand small businesses. So the question has to be asked, what will happen to that 30-some thousand small businesses that were actually getting federal government contract work and now have been eliminated from that process? And we look at other situations where the Congress has actually taken very positive steps to help small and minority businesses, but yet there's always been a drag in that process. One specific area, again, is with the Women's Small Business Procurement Program. And I know personally from experience, that program was passed in the late 1990s, and it took over 12 years for that program to actually get put in place with final regulations so that women with small businesses and minority women could actually take advantage of the federal procurement process. So we have a long way to go in terms of trying to correct the inequality that Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez talked about. And there are a lot of positive things on the horizon. And I know my great panelists will talk about some of those things as we move forward. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Major. I just want to ask one clarification. When you
Yes.
say that the businesses have dropped, not all of these businesses have filed for bankruptcy, correct? Some are just in limbo. What is happening to the businesses that just have shuttered, but maybe are still in limbo, haven't filed, but haven't reopened?
Well, one of the characteristics of some small businesses is that they close their doors and they never file for bankruptcy. I mean, bankruptcy is is clearly a very good process, but many of them just simply close their doors and walk away from the business and start another business, a little bit later. But so there is that number that actually just walk away from that business, and there's a number that actually do file bankruptcy, and many of those actually ultimately begin to rebuild. One of the unique things about small businesses, I think if you talk to most small business owners, many of them have had several businesses over a period of time. So even though we're talking about a drop, there has been some movement with some of these businesses re-engineering themselves and coming back. And we even saw during the COVID that some of those businesses, especially in the restaurant and service type businesses that could not provide their current service, they adapted to other types of services. There was a wine company, I believe, out in Montgomery County that started making sanitizers and things like this, just in order to keep the doors open and keep employees going. So the bottom line is that small and minority businesses are very resilient. I mean, so this COVID has had, yes, a very negative impact, but with the right resources, with the right types of structures put in place, they will come back hopefully even stronger.
Okay, well, thank you so much. So let me turn this over to Patrice to talk about the Biden administration's policy, all the different legislation that's pending, and whether the administration is going to be able to make good on its aspiration, in fact, to build back better.
Well, thank you, Sonni. And my name is Patrice Willoughby. I'm a managing director at Signal Group, which is a public affairs and government relations firm in Washington, D.C. And I want to thank the National Press Foundation for inviting me to speak to you about a topic that's been of interest and importance to me in my professional life. Major spoke to you about the statistics on minority and Black business contraction during the pandemic. But as you follow this story, there are a number of considerations that reflect the complexity of support that's needed for recovery. Next slide. At its source, small business resilience is directly tied to capitalization. Next slide. Entrepreneurs are often able to begin a business by self-funding or borrowing from family and friends. And if an entrepreneur owns property or they can borrow money at low interest rates, they start off with a degree of financial resilience. And that's often not the case with small minority, Black, and women entrepreneurs. Broadly, this slide and the next reflect data about the characteristics of business owners and their ability to access capital. Next slide. So the thin level of resilience that businesses have has wider effects because business owners often occupy positions of leadership within their communities, Black businesses in particular. Black business owners are also more likely to hire people within their communities. And so in the pandemic, effects that resulted in Black business failure also affected employment and also affected the economic resilience of small businesses and businesses within the larger community. If you look at a recent study by American Express, it found that for every dollar generated by privately held businesses, women business owners generated only 30 cents of every dollar. So that is another issue in the complexity that directly relates to access of capital. Next slide. Women business owners are really important in the ecosystem because prior to the pandemic, women presented the fastest growing segment of businesses in the market. They outpaced everyone. And within this category, Black women business owners grew fastest of all. In spite of these gains, American Express found that women business owners were not able to access capital. And Goldman Sachs, in its 10,000 Businesses program, identified that Black women were the most educated business owners, but still generated only 47 cents for every dollar generated by a white male business owner. This reflects data also Goldman found in this 10,000 Businesses program, which is an investment in partnership with the National Urban League. Black business owners are more likely to be rejected for bank funding. Of those with household income of $75,000 or less than 1/3 of Black business owners were able to access funding from a bank compared to 2/3 of white business owners. So access to capital is a critical issue for Black-owned and women-owned and minority and small businesses in general. Next slide. So solutions. During the at the onset of the new administration, the Biden-Harris administration indicated a number of initiatives to prioritize small business recovery as well as racial equity. And the private sector is also focused on ongoing and new initiatives that have come online during 2021. Next slide. Here are the 7 priorities of the administration, with racial equity in the economy being among the most important. Next slide. So in terms of the ongoing small business policies that are going on, an executive order was issued in January 2021 to advance racial equity. That was followed in May by a request for information by OMB, which is examining methods and practices across government for advancing equity and support, as well as assessments of the effectiveness of programs. Everyone is aware of the American Rescue Plan, which passed in March of 2021, and currently under consideration, the American Jobs Plan, introduced on March 31st of 2021, and the American Families Plan, which was introduced in April 28th of 2021. Negotiations on those bills are ongoing concerning the size and scope of them, but within each of these pieces of legislation, there have been targeted measures directed toward the ecosystem that helps small businesses to thrive. For example, Major spoke about the Paycheck Protection Program. That has ended. However, there are other SBA programs that address shuttered venues, economic injury, disaster loans, as well as assistance to restaurants. Within the American Jobs Plan, there are investments in community-based small business incubators and innovation hubs, which often provide the technical assistance that small businesses most need. Within Congress, there are also a number of bills which have been introduced. They're one by, and I've given some examples. Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence introduced a tax credit bill that would help small businesses in acquiring personal protective equipment. And there is a number of bills in the Senate. One here introduced by Senator Ben Cardin in the Senate and Representative Kwesi Mfume in the House, which would create innovation centers in underserved communities. Recently, Senator John Hickenlooper has also introduced a suite of 4 bills to create and expand SBA programs, but also to build up the infrastructure of cooperatives that are often used in business development in the Southwest, as well as within Native American communities. Next slide. Within the private sector, ongoing efforts, I mentioned Goldman's program, but also recently announced the Black Economic Alliance has initiated a $50 million fund in partnership with Wells Fargo that would fund and support small businesses. The National Credit Union Foundation supports community development financial institutions, minority banks, and credit unions to provide emergency assistance to small businesses. And these entities are and have been a focus of Congress because the first tranche of paycheck protection funding did not reach as many small businesses as intended. Congress doubled down and focused on CDFIs and minority depository institutions as some of the best entry points because those entities are often located and serve underserved communities and fund small businesses within those environments. And another initiative recently announced by New York Life, which is a $1 billion investment in partnership with Fairview Capital that would support diverse and emerging fund managers and small businesses seeking a market rate returns on those investments. Next slide. So, final thoughts. As you follow the story, please remember that, the last 20 years, we've had 2 devastating blows to the economic health of the nation. The financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 resulted in African Americans losing a great deal of accumulated family wealth from the foreclosures, the foreclosure epidemic. And following now the pandemic of 2020 has resulted in significant business closures. Both of these events are issues that have to be taken into consideration as programs attempt to build economic resilience and critically needed solutions for these communities. Thank you very much. My contact information is in the deck. The National Press Foundation is also able to provide it. And if you have questions or issues concerning where to identify specific resources on the subject matter, please feel free to reach out.
Well, Patrice, thank you so much for that. That's super helpful. I want to, before we go to Tony, I want to ask about the impact on children and families, because all the journalists on this call, I'm sure, are going to be covering the dollars and cents. And you mentioned the accumulation of wealth and the racial wealth gap, but each of these businesses, in many cases, is a family venture, represents a family. Can you talk about the impact on women entrepreneurs, and Major showed some of that data earlier, and on the impact of the loss of the closure of these minority-owned businesses on kids and families?
Sure, absolutely. So in my day job, I represent the fintech industry, and I work in financial services. And what we know from the data surrounding both access to capital from larger entities in like banks and CDFIs, and from fintech lenders, is that, as Major has indicated, women-owned businesses occupy a very large space of smaller enterprises. Often these are micro enterprises. The data that private lenders, fintech lenders have indicate that they are overrepresented in areas like catering, personal services, for example, beauty and healthcare, aesthetics. And these businesses in the pandemic had to close because people could not be with each other. And so, the effect on family income, because many of these are sole proprietorships, has been devastating to those small businesses. Many individuals have taken to the gig economy, piecing together smaller jobs in order to support families. And in this case, there has not been the backstop of other employment where small business owners could simply leave and step into a job, because particularly for women business owners, women also disproportionately shoulder the domestic burden within their families. And so the combination of small business closure, as well as some of the supports that are lacking sort of within our society, have been devastating on families in general.
Thank you so much. And Major, back to you for 1 minute. The Small Business Association, you shared with us earlier some data about how entrepreneurs with children at home are not doing very well compared to entrepreneurs, even amid everyone being hurt by the pandemic, entrepreneurs who did not have family responsibilities. Could you talk about that just briefly?
Yeah, I can. And, I think Patrice was very hit the points well. And I'm not an economist, so forgive me if I don't. For those who are out there are economists, forgive me if I don't hit all the points that you may be looking at. But by and large, small businesses many small businesses rely on family members to be part of that business structure. And as Patrice said, that when that business starts falling or beginning to experience a downturn in revenue and so forth, that owner has to begin to figure out what to do with those family members. Some can actually go out and find other jobs to kind of help subsidize. Many of them are not able to do that. So you have many small businesses, and I think a lot of people can relate to this, but many small businesses where the husband and wife have basically sent all of their kids to college. Or they've sent them through various things, and this has been the lifeline of that family. And when there is this type of downturn in the economy, it does not only impact the small business, but it impacts the other institutions that are also dependent on those small businesses for support, such as educational institutions and other things of this nature. So the report that you're talking about, and I think we will be able to put that report up on the website, or at least make it available to to the participants, but it is in much more detail in terms of some of those impacts.
Well, thank you so much. So everyone on the call, if you have questions, please raise your Zoom hand or put them in the chat. And for a look at how this is playing out on the local level in Baltimore, and also for some suggestions on solutions journalism and how journalists can cover what's kind of a grim story in a more positive and upbeat way, I'm turning you over here to Dr. Tony Draper, publisher of the Efron News in Baltimore.
Thank you, Sonni, and good afternoon to everyone and to my fellow panelists, Patrice and Major. Thank you. What wonderful information and data for all of us to use. I'm going to take a little different approach. As Sonni said, I'll be looking at it from through a local lens, and we agreed beforehand that I wouldn't do a deck, but I think I have a couple of slides that I will share. But let me just start this way. You heard my name. I am fourth generation journalist. My great grandfather started the Afro in 1892 when reportedly less than 2% of the Black population could read. And his mantra was that a newspaper exceeds because it believes first in God and in itself and in the present generation. And when I look back through the pages of the Afro and other Black newspapers, we've had many pandemics, tsunamis, you name it. We were there in 1918. We covered Tulsa in 1921 and everything else in between. And so as the publisher of a small business, we are Black-owned business as well. We have it from both sides, both from the business side and from the journalist side. So I just wanted to put that in context there and give a shout out to any of our other Black-owned media people who may be on this webinar. And so the Black press has been a trusted source for many years since its founding in 1827. However, the COVID response highlighted, magnified issues of inequities in health care and housing, access to healthy food, access to technology as we saw it in our education system, and again, just magnified the problems of access to capital for small businesses, especially Black businesses. This is not new. It just became more in your face, if you will, more on Front Street because of COVID. So I wanted to say that first, that as we're looking at recovery, Black businesses have been in recovery for a long time. And so Major Clark, I'm looking at you. You worked with Parent Mitchell, and Black businesses were in recovery then. And all the work that you've done, Patrice. So we've been in recovery. We've got to get out of recovery, and we have to recover, right? And so when I think about a state like Maryland that tops the list when it comes by all measurements, when it comes to being the best state for Black-owned businesses, based on a couple of factors: number of Black-owned businesses per capita, the amount of people employed by Black-owned businesses, percent of Black residents with a bachelor's degree or higher, or the percent of Black workers who work in management and business. Maryland ranks 1, Georgia ranks 2. Sometimes there's a flip-flop, but not with Maryland not being number 1. And so as Major said, Black businesses are not looking for a handout. We're not really looking for a hand up. We're looking for fellow Americans, especially journalists in general, to broaden the lens. We have to broaden the lens and not look through a lens of a position of what's wrong with the business, right? Or what's wrong with Black people or the Black or brown community, but recognizing the humanity and that we're all in this together. A lot of times we report from the what's wrong lens. And so we start with the problem, and we don't start with saying to ourselves a lot of times that, we are in this together, right? We're in this together. It's for the good of the entire economy. When Black businesses do well, white businesses benefit, the economy benefits because when small businesses do well, I think someone said already, small businesses are the economic engine of our country. And so when small businesses do well, then it bodes well for the entire country, right? And so if I talk about Baltimore, as Sonni said, I was going to drill down, and I will, into Baltimore. I have to make the connection between what happens with our businesses in Baltimore and the history of systemic and structural racism. I know all of us are probably tired of hearing those words, but we're going to have to keep hearing them until those structures are dismantled, right? So there's this history in Baltimore that's not necessarily related to business, because if we check our history, we will find out that Baltimore had one of the most thriving African-American middle-class populations in the entire country. But Maryland, and Baltimore in particular, is also well known for redlining and housing discrimination. I'm going to bring those two together, the impact of redlining on business, because we have some basic needs and some things to take care of, right? And so America's history of housing discrimination is long, and Baltimore leads all other cities. And so there was a local law by our city council that barred Black people from living on any block which was occupied by white people, any block. And then the federal government took it further and made home ownership accessible to whites through FHA loans, while denying the same loans to Black people and anyone who lived on the block. So if your basic needs are really under attack, then when you get to things like starting businesses, it makes it even more challenging to have a business that does well in Baltimore. Yet, I think as Patrice said, there are some suggestions of hope, and there's some things that are being done, right? And so I want to talk specifically now more about solutions, but let me lift up something, and it's both a solution and that's right. Thank you, Jeff. That's exactly where I was going. And so the Baltimore Development Corporation recognized, as many of us have recognized, that this is a problem with our businesses not surviving, not thriving, not growing, especially during this pandemic. And so they said, okay, you know what, we have some businesses that we give technical assistance to, but we also want to have some grant programs for businesses. But before we do that, we want to take a look. Let's take a look at how our businesses in Baltimore have fared based on race and access to the loans and the grants and things that were there, right? And so I want to say, before I go into this data, that if you need more information, the person to contact is there, because she will have so much more context about this. But take a look at this just across the race of African American, Hispanic, and whites. And so according to this data, and this is data about who received federal or state dollars to help in this recovery. And so if you look at this data, African Americans, Hispanics, whites, you'll see in May 2020, only 23% of African Americans had been able to were able to access either federal or state assistance, compared to 11% of Hispanics and 43% of whites. And so we know that we know the story around that first round and who got it. And if you didn't have a banking relationship, then you weren't even in the queue for some of these. But then let's fast forward to September, October, the fall of 2020. So by that time, 53% of African Americans had received some kind of federal or state assistance, right? Hispanics were about the same, 52%. But in that same period, 87% of whites had received it. And now you get to February of 2021, and only a very small move in African Americans, 3%, 56% received. The same for Hispanics, only a small move, but 95% of whites had received that assistance by the time you got to February of 2021. Ladies and gentlemen, that is an inequity right there. Just looking at that data, that's a really in-your-face data that says, how come? Why is this like that? And what could be done to make that, to change that narrative? Speaking of narratives, I said I was going to talk about solutions. And I'm sure that my fellow journalists have heard of this. In the Solutions Journalism Network, there was something that was introduced a few years ago called, a couple of years ago, it's fairly new, but complicating the narratives. And so you can Google that and you'll find this article, as I did, by Helen, and I'm going to butcher her middle name, Bienduti Hofer, Hofer, who has written about this design of how we as journalists produce journalism on complex topics such as this one, that generates understanding without causing further divides. We are in a very divided country. I'm sure I didn't tell anybody anything that you did not already know. We did not need to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd on yesterday to know that we're in a very divided country. And so the polarization seems to be greater. That impacts our communities negatively. It impacts our businesses. And so Solution Journalism Network says, okay, how about this? How about trying this complicating the narratives lens, if you will? And so it helps reporters. It's designed for reporters. It's not designed for other sectors, but it's based on psychology or theology or counseling. But it's a way that we talk with one another to get beneath the story, right? Beneath the story. So we can put this data out all day long and talk about the inequities and what's wrong. Well, what's wrong has been what's wrong, as I said, since Major Clark was hanging out with Parent Mitchell, or before, right? So it's been like that for a long time, but it helps reporters to produce journalism on complex topics that generates curiosity and understanding without further divides. And according to the article, creates paths for journalists to get to the depths of an issue rather than getting stuck in the noise and chaos of the moment, or being labeled as being in one camp or the other, as we see so vividly anytime we have a presidential election, and especially this last round. But it illuminates this problem or solution to an issue in a way that makes the conflict more comprehensible. And so it's based on these 4 pillars, listening differently. And so a lot of times we go in and we're asking questions. We're on deadline. We want to get it done. We want to file the story and then we're done with it. But asking questions in a way that there's some looping, that we really indicate that we understand. So I'm going to commend the article to you. When you read the article, they spend some time dissecting Oprah Winfrey's interviewing style for the 60-minute special that she did. But going beneath the problem to understand people's core beliefs, embracing the complexity, going beyond the immediate facts, right? And including historical or geographical context. We can't talk about Black business in America and not talk about Tulsa. We just can't. We can't. And then for those who said, I didn't know about Tulsa till last year. Well, it's 100 years old this year. And so we have to be intentional about digging into those historical facts. And that's something that the Black press did well. Let me offer this to journalists. The Afro's historical papers from 1893 to 1988 are available free of charge on the Enoch Pratt Free Library. That's Baltimore City's free library system. You can get it. You just need a card, and the card is free. And so I would just commend that to you. And there are 9 or 10 other Black newspapers archives who are there for a particular historical period. Because if we just dig into it from the mainstream press for these issues that relate to African Americans, we are probably not going to get the underlying assumptions that I just talked about, or to understand that complexity. And so we have to counter confirmation bias. All right, and I'm still giving credit to this article.
So Tony, I'm sorry to interrupt. We have a bunch of questions.
Oh, okay.
Can I ask you to stop for just a minute, and we'll come back to you and because we do have reporters on deadline here. Let me turn over a few. And we have a question here from Kayla Roeder with the Durango Herald in Colorado. Kayla wants to know whether the speakers think that Hickenlooper's new proposed bill, which you mentioned earlier, Patrice, would be effective in helping businesses post-COVID. Are solutions like this at the federal level effective, or should there be more of a local approach? I'll mention that we will be posting all the slides after this, so don't worry if you were scribbling down the bills that Patrice ripped through. There'll be plenty of time. You can check that out later. But so how is what do you think of the Hickenlooper's 4 bills? And is the federal approach right, or does it have to be locally based? Patrice,
Well, I'll jump in first, and the answer is both. And coordination is really important. I think that the senator has correctly identified that cooperatives are really at the ground level. So that really is a local solution, which the policy has to be defined at the federal level. But there are other there are other bits of focus in this suite of bills for Native Americans, as well as tweaks to SBA programs that Major can address. Yes, the federal approach is important, but the federal approach and the policy must connect with local needs. And that is why it's important, as you follow the story, to always ask about coordination and whether or not a solution that's proposed has been targeted at the community with the need.
Okay. And in some of the documents that on this bill, it talked about the access to capital issue, which is where you started. And it said that in terms of venture capital, something like 97% of that is controlled by whites in 3 cities, right? In New York, Silicon Valley, and I'm forgetting the third. And only 2% of that money is flowing to African-American businesses, even though we're hearing a lot about African-American and other minority entrepreneurships. Can you talk a little bit about whether you think the Hickenlooper bill will affect this access to capital issue?
I think that it will affect the access to capital issue for the communities that he's targeted. I mean, I defer to Major on the operation of the program itself within SBA.
I agree that the legislation, any legislation for small and minority business, if it's positive legislation, is good. Now, I will go a little bit further though, and I will say that again, from past experience, we have they're talking about the SBIC program, I think part of the legislation. And we did at one point in time have a program called the MESBIC program, the Minority Enterprise Small Business Investment Program, which was very targeted to minority businesses primarily. And that program actually had a lot of ups and downs, but it was eventually felt that the SBIC program could serve the needs of minority businesses as well. And we have not seen that by the statistics Sonni that you just cited, we haven't seen that to any large extent. So I think that when we start looking at legislation, and I'm also saying this having been a former Hill staffer drafting legislation, and believe that, and I firmly believe that legislation has to be very well structured, very well targeted to meet its objectives. Otherwise, we come back 5 years from now and we say this didn't really work, and X billions of dollars have been spent, and no one has actually benefited from it. So my recommendation would be for the legislation to be more targeted and more specific as to its goals and objectives, and also to include measurements in the legislation so that it can be measured effectively in terms of what it's trying to do.
Okay, Kayla, did that answer your question? If not, please raise your hand. Any other questions out there? While we're waiting, I wanted to talk about another, we're talking a lot about Hickenlooper.
And I will say, and that response doesn't mean that that legislation is bad, but I just think it has to, it needs a little tweaking to make it more effective based on what I've seen out here in this environment.
Right. So another area of interest is the clean energy, the administration's push on clean energy and the procurement. And Major, your previous data indicated that African American and Latino-owned businesses in particular were not very effective at getting the federal contracts that they would qualify to bid on. In the clean energy, Hickenloopen's bill on clean energy, as I understand it, is going to double the loan amount. Or at least that's a proposal to double the loan amount for businesses so that they want to, kind of do their own energy improvements in their businesses. Do you think that is a useful approach for small business and for minority-owned businesses? In other words, we've seen that the loan amounts that African American businesses get, for example, are just so much smaller.
We've seen that the loan amounts are smaller, and we continue to talk about a lack of access to capital, and we'll probably keep discussing this for a long time. But I think there's a lot of other undercurrents that must be examined when we start talking about this whole capital issue, and a lot of it came out with the PPP, and that is that and that data that Dr. Draper presented in terms of Baltimore, in terms of the loans going to African American and to minority and Hispanic businesses. And one of the things we find is that, and I think it's got to be part of got to be part of a solution, and that is that we're going to have to revisit the current credit structure that we have in the United States. And I'm not saying, that credit structure is one in which a lot of, and this is not a stepping on your toes, Patrice, but a lot of people make a lot of money off of the credit market, and that's okay. And I think we're in a capitalist society, and that should be, the benchmark. But when we start looking at credit ratings, and I just saw some data the other day where I think a lot of minority businesses are falling in the 600 credit rating, which basically puts them at a lower end of being eligible for credit. And it's not only at a lower end, they're also putting them at a higher rate for the money that they are borrowing. So I think we got to start looking at what this credit rating really is designed to do, and become more proactive, more structured in terms of how, if it can be changed. And that's a combination of conversations from the private sector and everyone else that's involved with it. I don't have an answer as to what the change should look like, but I do know that when minority businesses and Black businesses are rated at a lower level, they're paying more for the amount of money that they're borrowing and getting less for it. So when we talk about the Green Fund program and increasing it, then I think we got to balance that with what actually is the ultimate outcome.
So, and in some, adding on to what Major has said, I absolutely agree in that in the private sector, there are a number of innovations, technology-based innovations, which are taking those disparities into consideration. Some of the well-regarded fintech lenders use a variety of other data points. For example, inventory, revenue, receivables as proxies for credit, because a lot of small businesses will have a poor credit score, but a great business, but they can't access capital in an economic way when they need it. And so that has been fueling really the growth of the fintech industry.
Yeah, and go back to also what Dr. Draper said in terms of Baltimore, just in terms of the real estate and the redlining that was taking place. So when you have an African-American business that's living in Baltimore and living in, and I lived in Baltimore for a long time. Anyway, but living in Baltimore, living in West Baltimore, and the house that they're living in, if you move that house to somewhere out in suburbia, that house may very well be a $500,000-$600,000 home. But in West Baltimore, because of redlining and everything else, that house is now valued at maybe $200,000 at best. That has a tremendous impact, negative impact on the business owner that's trying to use that house as collateral, which most banks will require that business owner to put that house up, for collateral. So, all of those things really begin to tie into, to the loan process. And, Dr. Draper's information was very, very correct in terms of, the impact of that. I call it, in the social entrepreneurship, process.
Okay, well, our time is up. Thank you all so much for your insights, your data, the hard work you did digging up great facts for this program. This will be recorded. The decks will be posted, and I know all the speakers will be happy to answer your questions. I want to thank you again for joining the National Press Foundation. Our motto is to make good journalists better. We look forward to reading the stories and hearing the broadcasts that you create as a result of this. And again, I want to thank the speakers and our guests. Thank you. Goodbye.